Welcome back to Stamps US, where we explore fascinating old American stamps, their history, rarity, and what collectors may be willing to pay for them today. In this video, we are taking a closer look at a remarkable piece of early American postal history, the 1918 United States 16-cent air mail stamp, a stamp connected to one of the most exciting chapters in the history of American aviation and mail delivery. At first glance, this small green stamp may not look like something extraordinary. It features a powerful winged emblem in the center, the words U.S. Postage across the top, and the denomination of 16 cents at the bottom and on both sides. But this stamp represents a period when sending mail by airplane was still a revolutionary idea. In 1918, the United States was experimenting with a completely new way of transporting letters. And these early airmail stamps became part of that historic transformation. The stamp shown here is commonly identified as the 16-cent 1918 airmail issue. Scott C2. It was part of the first generation of U.S. airmail stamps created specifically for this new service. The design is unmistakable, with large wings stretching across the center and the U.S. airmail emblem positioned prominently between them. The combination of the classic engraving style and aviation imagery gives this stamp a unique appearance that immediately separates it from many ordinary U.S. postage stamps of the same era. To understand why this stamp matters, we have to go back to the beginning of American airmail. In the early 20th century, airplanes were still a relatively new technology. Flying was dangerous, expensive, and unpredictable compared with modern aviation. Yet the possibility of using aircraft to move mail faster across the country captured the imagination of postal officials and the public. The United States Post Office began experimenting with scheduled airmail service, and in 1918 the first official routes were established. That makes these early airmail stamps especially interesting to collectors. They aren't simply pieces of paper used to pay postage. They are connected to the moment when the United States was beginning to build an entirely new transportation system. Every genuine example is a small reminder of the early days of American aviation and the incredible technological changes taking place during that period. The 16-cent denomination is another important feature. Early airmail postage rates were very different from the rates we know today. The cost reflected the special nature of transporting mail by aircraft and the limited infrastructure available at the time. These stamps were therefore used for a specialized postal service rather than ordinary everyday letters. The design itself is also worth examining carefully. The central winged emblem represents the new age of aviation. The engraving is detailed, and the stamp has the distinctive perforated edges associated with stamps of the period. When you look closely at a well-preserved example, you can appreciate the fine line work and printing techniques used more than a century ago. But here's where things become especially important for collectors. Not every 1918 16-cent airmail stamp has the same value. Two stamps can look almost identical to someone who isn't familiar with philately, yet their market values can be dramatically different. Condition, centering, gum, perforations, cancellation, color, and overall appearance can all influence what a collector might be willing to pay. One of the first things collectors examine is the centering. Ideally, the printed design should sit evenly between the perforations on all four sides. A stamp with unusually balanced margins can be much more desirable than one where the design is noticeably shifted toward one edge. With classic U.S. stamps, excellent centering can make a major difference, particularly when the stamp is otherwise in exceptional condition. The next factor is condition. Collectors look for faults such as tears, creases, thins, stains, missing perforations, heavy damage, or other imperfections. A stamp that has survived more than 100 years without significant damage can be much more attractive than an example that has been heavily handled or damaged. The gum on an unused stamp can also be important. Original gum that has been well preserved may increase desirability, while disturbed, damaged, or regummed gum can affect a stamp's collectability. For this reason, collectors don't simply look at the front of an old stamp. They may carefully examine the back as well. The cancellation is another major consideration. A used example with a light, clean cancellation that doesn't cover the main design can sometimes be visually appealing. On the other hand, a heavy cancellation across the center can make the stamp less attractive to certain collectors. The exact postal history can also matter, especially when a stamp is connected to an interesting cover, route, or historical event. And there is another important lesson when dealing with old stamps. Catalog value is not necessarily the same thing as the amount a stamp will actually sell for. Prices can vary according to condition, certification, market demand, and the venue where the stamp is sold. Auction prices, dealer asking prices, catalog estimates, and actual realized prices are not always the same. This is why you should be careful whenever you see claims online that an ordinary-looking old stamp is automatically worth thousands or tens of thousands of dollars. A 1918 airmail stamp can certainly be collectible and historically important, but its exact value must be determined from the specific example in front of you. For serious collectors, professional authentication and grading can become extremely important. A certified stamp gives buyers greater confidence that the item is genuine and that its condition has been independently evaluated. This becomes particularly important with valuable classic U.S. stamps because the market contains altered, repaired, regummed, and misidentified examples, and if you happen to discover one of these stamps in an old collection, don't immediately start cleaning it or trying to improve its appearance. Never attempt to wash, iron, flatten, trim, or otherwise alter an antique stamp. What may look like a flaw to someone unfamiliar with philately could actually be part of the stamp's history, and an attempted repair could significantly reduce its value. The 1918 airmail issues are also interesting because they belong to the same fascinating era that produced one of the most famous stamps in American history, the 24-cent Curtis Jenny, better known as the inverted Jenny. That stamp became famous because a small number were printed with the airplane image inverted relative to the surrounding frame. The inverted Jenny is much rarer and dramatically more valuable, but the connection is important because both stamps belong to America's earliest airmail period. The stamp we're examining today should therefore not be confused with the inverted Jenny. The 16-cent stamp shown here is a different issue, and its value depends heavily on its individual condition and characteristics. Imagine holding a genuine example in your hands. This tiny piece of paper has survived more than a century. When it was new, aviation was still in its infancy. The world had not yet entered the modern age of commercial air travel. Airports as we know them today didn't exist, and flying across the country was an extraordinary achievement. Yet this little stamp was part of the system that helped make aviation-based mail delivery a reality. That's one of the reasons stamp collecting is so fascinating. The monetary value is only one part of the story. A stamp can be valuable because of rarity, condition, historical importance, printing characteristics, or simply because it represents a major moment in history. So, if you find a 1918 16-cent U.S. airmail stamp in an inherited collection, an old album, an estate sale box, or a forgotten envelope, take a closer look. Check the denomination, design, perforations, condition, and cancellation. Compare it carefully with reliable catalogs. And if you believe you may have an especially unusual or high-quality example, consider getting it examined by a qualified stamp expert. And remember, never assume a price based only on a picture online. A photograph can help identify a stamp, but it usually cannot determine its exact market value. The back of the stamp, gum condition, perforations, centering, faults, and cancellation may all be important. The 1918 16-cent airmail stamp is a beautiful example of how a seemingly tiny object can preserve an enormous piece of history. It represents the beginning of America's airmail era, the development of aviation technology, and the changing way Americans communicated across long distances. Next up, we are taking a close look at a remarkable classic U.S. stamp featuring one of the most recognizable presidents in American history, Abraham Lincoln. At first glance, this small black and white stamp may look simple, but its age, engraving, historical connection, and place in early American philately make it a fascinating piece for collectors. The stamp shown here is a 15-cent Abraham Lincoln U.S. postage stamp from the classic 1860 seconds era. Lincoln's portrait dominates the center of the design, surrounded by an elaborate engraved frame with decorative scrollwork, columns, and the words U.S. postage. The denomination, 15 cents, appears prominently at the top and bottom. This is the kind of stamp that immediately captures attention because it combines an important historical figure with the beautiful engraving style used by American stamp printers more than a century ago. What makes this stamp especially interesting is the person shown on it. Abraham Lincoln became one of the most important figures in American history, serving as the 16th President of the United States during the Civil War. His presidency changed the course of the nation, and after his assassination in 1865, Lincoln became an enduring symbol of American history. Stamps featuring his portrait therefore carry an importance that goes far beyond their postage value. The appearance of Lincoln on American postage also reflects how quickly his image became part of the nation's visual identity. During the 19th century, postage stamps were becoming an increasingly important form of communication, and portraits of famous Americans gave these tiny pieces of paper a powerful connection to national history. Now take a close look at the engraving. Unlike modern stamps, which are generally produced using highly automated printing methods, classic U.S. stamps were created with incredibly detailed engraving techniques. Fine lines were used to create Lincoln's facial features, hair, clothing, and the surrounding frame. When you enlarge a genuine classic stamp, you can often see an extraordinary amount of detail packed into an area smaller than a postage envelope. That intricate engraving is one of the reasons classic U.S. stamps remain so popular with collectors. Every line had to be carefully reproduced, and imperfections, printing differences, perforations, paper characteristics, and other details can help specialists determine exactly which issue they are looking at. But here's where things become very important. Not every old Lincoln stamp is automatically worth a fortune. The exact identification of a stamp is critical. Similar-looking Lincoln issues were produced during the 19th century, and differences in printing, perforations, paper, grills, cancellations, and other characteristics can separate one catalog variety from another. Condition is also extremely important. Collectors carefully examine the perforations around the edges, looking for missing, damaged, or irregular perforations. They also inspect the paper for creases, tears, thinning, stains, or other damage. A stamp that has survived for more than 150 years in excellent condition can be dramatically more desirable than an otherwise identical stamp with significant faults. Another major factor is centering. On a well-centered classic U.S. stamp, the design sits relatively evenly between the perforations. Poorly centered examples can be much more common. While unusually well-centered examples may attract considerably more attention from serious collectors, the cancellation can also tell us something about the stamp's history. Many 19th-century stamps were used in everyday postal service and received cancellation marks from post offices. Some cancellations are heavy and cover much of the design, while others are lighter and leave Lincoln's portrait clearly visible. Certain unusual or scarce cancellations can themselves become an important collecting specialty, and then there is the question every collector wants answered: how much could a stamp like this be worth today? The answer is not as simple as looking at the denomination and multiplying it by a number. The 15-cent face value has almost nothing to do with its modern collector value. Its value depends on the precise stamp identification, condition, centering, cancellation, paper, gum status if unused, and whether it has been professionally authenticated or certified. A common example in heavily used condition might have a relatively modest collector value, while a particularly scarce variety or an exceptionally preserved example can command much more. This is why responsible collectors should never assume that every 19th century stamp featuring Lincoln is worth thousands or tens of thousands of dollars. For an especially valuable example, certification can be extremely important. Professional experts can examine the stamp for authenticity, condition, repairs, alterations, and other characteristics that may not be obvious to an inexperienced collector. This is particularly important with classic U.S. stamps because their age and value make them attractive to both collectors and specialists in philatelic varieties. There is also an important lesson here for anyone who discovers old stamps in a family collection. Do not clean the stamp. Do not try to flatten it. Do not trim the edges. And do not attempt to repair damage yourself. Even a seemingly harmless alteration can affect the stamp's collector value. If you discover something that looks unusual or potentially valuable, the safest approach is to preserve it exactly as you found it and have it examined by someone knowledgeable in classic U.S. philately. Imagine the history represented by this tiny piece of paper. It was produced in an America that looked completely different from the country we know today. Transportation was slower, communication was changing rapidly, and the nation was still dealing with the enormous consequences of the Civil War. Lincoln's image on a postage stamp connected everyday correspondence with one of the most consequential periods in American history, and that's what makes old stamps so fascinating. They are not simply collectibles. They are miniature historical documents. A stamp can tell us about presidents, wars, transportation, technology, printing, economics, art, and everyday life. Sometimes a tiny piece of paper can tell a much larger story than its size suggests. If you have an old Lincoln stamp in your collection, don't judge it only by its appearance. Look carefully at the denomination, the portrait, the frame, the perforations, the cancellation, and the paper. Compare it with a trusted U.S. stamp catalog and, if necessary, seek professional identification. Two stamps that appear nearly identical to the naked eye can sometimes belong to completely different catalog varieties, and remember, online photographs can be useful for preliminary identification, but they cannot always reveal everything that determines a stamp's value. The back of the stamp can be just as important as the front. Gum, paper characteristics, grills, hidden repairs, thinning, and other features may require close examination. This Lincoln stamp is a perfect reminder that age alone does not determine value. Rarity, condition, authenticity, demand, and specific variety all play a role. That's why the world of classic U.S. stamps is so exciting. There is always another detail to discover, another variety to identify, and another piece of history waiting to be uncovered. So, if you have old U.S. stamps sitting inside a forgotten album, inherited collection, envelope, or box, don't throw them away and don't assume they're worthless. Take your time and examine them carefully. That ordinary-looking stamp could potentially be an interesting piece of American postal history. Abraham Lincoln's portrait has appeared on many different U.S. stamps throughout history, but the classic engraved Lincoln issues from the 19th century remain particularly fascinating because they connect philately directly to the period immediately following, one of the most dramatic chapters in American history. Here on Stamps US, we don't just look at the price printed on a stamp. We look at the story behind it, the details that make it collectible, and the clues that can help determine whether an old stamp deserves a closer examination. Next up, we're taking a close look at a classic green 1-cent George Washington U.S. postage stamp, a small piece of American postal history that has remained popular with collectors for generations. At first glance, this stamp may look simple. It features a detailed portrait of George Washington in the center, surrounded by a rectangular frame, with the words Washington, 1, and U.S. postage clearly visible. The green color and engraved style portrait give it the unmistakable appearance of a classic American definitive stamp. George Washington is one of the most frequently featured individuals in American philately. As the first president of the United States and one of the country's most important historical figures, his portrait has appeared on countless U.S. stamps, but that doesn't mean every Washington stamp has the same value. In fact, identifying the exact issue is one of the most important steps for any collector. The stamp shown here is a 1-cent Washington issue from the 20th century definitive era, recognizable by its green color, Washington portrait, and distinctive rectangular design. Stamps like this were produced in large quantities for everyday postal use. People used inexpensive 1-cent stamps for ordinary correspondence and other postal purposes, meaning millions of examples could enter circulation. And this brings us to one of the biggest misconceptions about old stamps. Being old does not automatically mean being extremely valuable. A stamp can be decades old and still be relatively common. What collectors really look for is a combination of age, scarcity, condition, unusual varieties, printing characteristics, and demand. For a 1-cent Washington stamp like this, the first step is proper identification. Collectors compare the design, denomination, color, printing method, perforations, paper, watermark if applicable, and other characteristics against specialized U.S. stamp catalogs. Small differences that are almost impossible to notice at first glance can sometimes distinguish one catalog number from another. The condition of the stamp is also extremely important. Collectors carefully inspect the perforations around the edges. Are they complete and intact? Are any perforations missing? Has the stamp been torn or damaged? Does it have creases, folds, stains, or thinning? Every one of these details can influence collectability. Centering is another major factor. Ideally, the printed design should be positioned evenly inside the perforated edges. A beautifully centered stamp can be considerably more attractive to collectors than one where the design is noticeably shifted to one side. The gum on an unused stamp can also be important. If the stamp has original gum that has been preserved in excellent condition, it may be more desirable than an example that has been heavily disturbed or regummed. This is one reason collectors often examine both the front and back of a stamp before making any judgment about its condition. The cancellation can tell us another part of the story. Used stamps often carry cancellation marks showing that they actually traveled through the postal system. Some cancellations are light and leave most of Washington's portrait visible, while others may cover a large portion of the design. In certain cases, unusual cancellations or postal history connections can make an otherwise ordinary stamp much more interesting. Now let's talk about the potential value. If you find a 1-cent Washington stamp like this in an old album, you should not assume that it is automatically worth hundreds or thousands of dollars simply because it looks old. Many Washington 1-cent stamps were printed in very large quantities. However, specific varieties, errors, exceptional condition, or scarce examples can be much more desirable. This is where the real excitement of stamp collecting begins. A collector might look at hundreds of similar Washington stamps and then discover that one example has a particular variety or characteristic that makes it different. That tiny difference could be something related to the printing, perforations, paper, color, or another technical feature. For this reason, magnification can be extremely useful. A simple magnifying glass can reveal details that aren't obvious to the naked eye. Serious collectors may use stronger magnification and specialized tools to examine printing characteristics and perforations. Another important point is authentication. If you believe you've discovered an unusually rare or valuable variety, professional examination can be worthwhile. Experts can determine whether the stamp is genuine, whether it has been repaired or altered, and whether its characteristics match a recognized variety, and if you're searching through an inherited collection. There's one rule you should always remember: don't try to clean or repair the stamps yourself. Never wash them, scrape them, flatten them with an iron, trim the edges, or attempt to remove cancellations. What appears to be an improvement can actually destroy collector value. The history behind this stamp is also fascinating. George Washington's connection with American postage goes back to the earliest days of U.S. stamp production. His image became one of the most recognizable symbols in American philately, and Washington definitives were produced repeatedly as the postal system developed. This particular 1-cent design represents an era when postage stamps were everyday objects. Unlike expensive collectibles kept safely in albums, many stamps like this were handled millions of times. They were placed on envelopes, canceled at post offices, transported across the country, and eventually discarded. The examples that survived in good condition give modern collectors a glimpse into ordinary American communication from decades ago, and that's what makes a seemingly inexpensive stamp worth examining. Its importance isn't always about a massive price tag. Sometimes its value comes from the history it represents and the role it played in the development of the American postal system. If you have one of these stamps, carefully examine the front and back. Look at the denomination, Washington portrait, color, perforations, centering, cancellation, and overall condition. Then compare it with a trusted U.S. stamp catalog rather than relying on a random online price. Most importantly, remember that catalog values and actual selling prices are not necessarily the same. The real market price depends on the specific stamp, its condition, demand, and where it is sold. An ordinary example may have only modest collector value, while a rare variety or exceptional example could attract significantly more attention. So, could this little green Washington stamp make you rich? Probably not, simply because it is an old 1-cent stamp. But could it be an interesting and collectible piece of American history? Absolutely. And if you discover an unusual variety, error, or exceptionally preserved example, that's when the story can become much more interesting. That's the beauty of collecting U.S. stamps. You don't need a giant treasure chest to discover something fascinating. Sometimes the most interesting pieces are hiding inside an old family album, a forgotten envelope, or a box that hasn't been opened for decades. George Washington's portrait has appeared on an enormous number of American stamps, but every individual stamp still has a story. This tiny green 1-cent issue reminds us of a time when postage was an essential part of everyday communication and when these small pieces of paper traveled across the United States carrying letters, documents, and personal messages. So before you overlook an old Washington stamp because it has only one printed on it, take a closer look. Check the details. Compare the design. Examine the perforations. Look for unusual characteristics. And most importantly, learn exactly which stamp you have, because in the world of U.S. stamp collecting, the difference between an ordinary stamp and a Special stamp can sometimes be incredibly small, but discovering that difference is what makes the hunt so exciting. If you enjoyed this look at the classic George Washington 1-cent stamp, make sure to stay with Stamps US for more fascinating discoveries from the world of American philately. Keep checking those old collections, keep learning the different varieties, and never assume that a tiny piece of paper has no story to tell. You never know what you might discover hiding in plain sight.